Excellencies, distinguished guests, if we could begin now, thank you very much. I'll just ask our speakers, Excellencies, to take your seats on the stage, and then I also want to apologize to our online audience members. This is what happens with the hybrid. People would like to see each other, so sometimes they take a little time to speak and to have conversation. When we're online, we can start pretty much exactly on time. But when in person, sometimes it's a minute or two late. My name is Thitinan Pongsuchak. Good morning to everyone. We are based at ASEAN Thailand Institute of Security and International Studies, which is under the Faculty of Political Science at Chulalongkorn University. To begin, I would just like to invite the Dean of Faculty, Dr. Ek Nansapatana, to give us some, to open the proceedings, give us some welcome remarks, and then we'll go from there. Ajahn Ek,ครับเชิญครับ
Good morning to everyone, and welcome to ASEAN Thailand Public Forum today on Russia's war in Ukraine, 2 weeks on, consequences and directions. Yesterday was actually the completion of the 14th day of the war after Russia's invasion of Ukraine on 24th February. We are here today to look at some of the dynamics, consequences, and directions, and what might come next. As the biggest war in Europe in nearly 8 decades, this conflict between the two sides bears ramifications for all of us in this room. While our event today is hybrid, here in person, but also online. Many of our audience members will recall that we had an earlier online event on the Russia-Ukraine war on 4th March that included speakers from Moscow in Russia and Kiev in Ukraine, along with 2 Thai scholars from Chulalongkorn University and Thammasat University. Today, we turn to perspectives from other countries by bringing together comments and views from ambassadors and heads of mission of European Union, Poland, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand, as well as a former Thai foreign minister. Some of the issues and topics to be addressed today include the Russian invasion in view of the United Nations Charter and international law, Ukraine's predicament involving domestic determination against Russia's military separation, and Russia's dilemma in case of war drags on. We will also examine the laws of the United States, the European Union, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations and the United Nations, whether this broad coalition can sustain sanctions and how they might handle the consequences from refugee and humanitarian crisis against the backdrops of Russia's advance and Ukraine vulnerabilities. ASEAN member states' position and postures, including Thailand, will also be discussed. As the Dean of the Faculty of Political Science, which oversees ASEAN Thailand and at this university, I want to reassure our audience members here in this room, those currently online and others who may watch the recording later, that ASEAN Thailand has a long established track record of being a platform for Thailand to understand the outside world and for the world outside to understand what goes on here in Thailand. We have organized over 1,000 events over the past decade, and our audience members have included many diplomats, academics, journalists, students, international organizations, and others over the years. We are fair-minded, and our platform is broad and diverse. But I also want to say with emphasis here that we reserve the right to organize events as we see fit and reasonable in fulfillment of our duty and in keeping with our hard-won reputation. Let me now thank to our speaker for sharing their views, insights, and experiences with us this morning. His Excellency, Mr. David Daly, Ambassador of the European Union to the Kingdom of Thailand. His Excellency, Mr. Waldemar Duban-Minovsky, Ambassador of the Republic of Poland to the Kingdom of Thailand. His Excellency, Mr. Mark Gooding, OBE, Ambassador of the United Kingdom to the Kingdom of Thailand. Ms. Mary Thurston, Charge d'Affaires of New Zealand to the Kingdom of Thailand, and also the former New Zealand Ambassador to Poland accredited to Ukraine. His Excellency Professor Kantati Supamongkol, 39th Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Thailand and Advisory Board Member, Grant Cooperation Center for Asia Pacific Policy, the United States of America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ขอบคุณครับอาจารย์เอก Let me proceed this way by first noting that we have a lot of space here. Normally this room, if you can imagine, it has hosted more than 180 people, up to 200 people under normal circumstances, but we have COVID restrictions and protocols, so we have plenty of space. I would like to start on a sober note. Normally we've had events and public forums here on campus on many issues: Thailand, ASEAN, US, China, South China Sea, Mekong region. But these events in the past have not involved lives being lost on the ground as we hold the events. So in fact, at this hour, over the past 2 weeks, it was a 2-week mark yesterday, the Russia war in Ukraine has claimed many, many lives, and I think has brought, will lead to many more consequences. So we're interested in looking at the consequences, the impacts of the war, and to maybe in a forward-looking way to see where all of this is leading, is going. So I want to thank, like the Dean has said, all of the ambassadors and former foreign minister here for joining us. As the Dean also has said, we also had an event last week that featured a speaker from Russia in Moscow, and also a speaker from Kiev in Ukraine. Today we're hearing and listening to perspectives from the EU, Poland, United Kingdom, New Zealand, Thailand. And in future we have other events. So as the Dean said, we are fair-minded. So let me begin by just, there's no need to say a lot about the nature of the war when it happened. On February 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine, and since then there have been a lot of death and destruction and a lot of controversy and headline news every day. So we have just ambassadors sharing experiences and views. To start with Ambassador David Daly from the European Union. Ambassador Daly was formerly ambassador of the EU to Sri Lanka and the Maldives, Australia, New Zealand. Very illustrious, long time career, starting out with the Irish Ministry of Foreign Affairs initially, and then he joined the EU External Services, the external ministry of the EU. So Ambassador Daly EU 27 now. The European Union has been the crowning achievement of the post-war order, really, over 7 decades, almost 8 decades, going back to the 1940s. It started out with 6 countries, now 27, enlarged. So this war on the very outskirts, bordering the EU now, will it have, what kind of impact is it generating for the European Union? And it is the case that it has been argued that, Ukraine wanted to join the European Union, and the European Union, in reaction to the war, has imposed wide-ranging and deep sanctions on Russian interests and individuals. So from your perspective, Ambassador Daly, what are we seeing here over the past 2 weeks, and what might we expect from the European Union's vantage point in the coming days and weeks? Ambassador Daly.
Thank you very much. First, could I say how honored I am to be here in this wonderful historic university, and to be here today on this panel. So thank you very much for inviting me. Well, I mean, as you know, like many others, the European Union condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We see Russia, a nuclear country, invading a next-door neighbor, threatening reprisals against others. We see this as a defining moment for Europe and for the world. We face an historic choice between the international community being ruled by law on the one side, or being governed by force on the other, military might. There are three words I would use to describe the consequences for the European Union since the invasion. They are shock, unity, and complacency, or rather the end of complacency. The immediate impact, of course, has been shock. I mean, shock for all of us globally, but for Europeans, especially in the European Union. We thought that we'd seen the last of this type of war in Europe, this type of aggressive, invasive war. Now, we mustn't forget Russia's actions in the Donbass region in 2014, nor should we forget Crimea, nor should we forget Georgia in 2008. And we should also not forget the Balkan Wars of the 90s, which were much more a violent implosion of a country, riven with tensions. But still, it was not the invasion of one country by another. The European Union was born out of war in order to break out of a cycle of wars which had dogged our countries every 50 years going back to the 18th century. Wars between France and Germany and other countries in Europe every 50 years. The European Union was an attempt to try and live together in a different way in order to break out of that cycle of war. And as such, I think we can be very proud of the fact that the European Union has been successful as a peace process. No more war between the member states of the European Union, between those countries. Of course, against that background, what's happening on our border is extremely shocking. So that's the first impact that it has had. Second impact, I would say, is unity of purpose. The war has had a galvanizing effect. I mean, the European Union has moved quickly from shock to action. We've taken extraordinary decisions in the last week. Decisions on sanctions, decisions on SWIFT, decisions on banning airlines, decisions on using European Union funding in the area of arms, historic decisions. And these decisions require unanimity within the European Union. So these are the decisions of 27 sovereign states acting together as the European Union. Success can breed complacency. And in this sense, I think one of the impacts is as a wake-up call within the European Union. And of course, a wake-up call more globally as well. I mean, what is happening today in Europe, it is something that could happen anywhere if the European Charter is trampled on. And so to that extent, it may be happening in Europe, but it is an attack on all of us. And of course, there we see the importance of us coming together as the global community, 141 countries, including 8 ASEAN countries, including Thailand. The importance of us coming together in deploring Russia's aggression against Ukraine and supporting the UNGA resolution. But it is a call to arms to fight against complacency within the European Union. We are losing in Europe the World War II generation of leaders. And so the narrative of those leaders who had wanted to consciously build a different type of Europe, those leaders are now passing on. And success can breed complacency. A lot is taken for granted by the new generation in Europe. Take for granted that you can travel anywhere in Europe, you can work anywhere, study anywhere. When you go to another member state, you have the same rights there as a citizen of a member state of the European Union as the citizens of that country. So there's a lot that is wonderful about the European Union, but a lot of that has been taken for granted. Now, there is a phrase, eaten bread is soon forgotten, which describes this type of complacency. What this, one of the impacts, in my view, of this war is that it reminds us that every generation has to take its turn at the wheel. Every generation within the European Union must put the effort in to safeguarding the European Union, safeguarding our values, safeguarding what we have achieved. And in this sense, not even the prospect, but the actuality of war right on our border, directly affecting us, this gives a renewed narrative for continuing with our project, continuing to safeguard our values within the European Union. In a way, it's a new European Union that's being born now. It's a world which is not necessarily a benign world. Perhaps we had thought it was more benign than it is, or that it has proven to be. We see a new impetus to issues that have been on our agenda for a number of years, recognized as important, but now are certainly getting a fast forward. For example, in the area of defense, European defense discussions within the European Union, or even in areas such as energy strategy, renewable energy. I mean, the war highlights the important dependency of European Union member states on energy sources from Russia. So this gives a boost now to energy efficiency in the European Union, a boost to diversifying our energy supplies. So many things that have been on our agenda, and we've been working on them and making progress, but now they get a fast forward because of this this tragic episode. And of course, we'll have to pay for all of this. And we are already paying for it. We're paying for it in the measures we're taking to support Ukraine, but we're also paying for it through higher energy bills. We will pay for it globally through the wheat prices, which will go through the roof, increasing feedstuff, animal feed, etc., etc. The reconstruction of Ukraine afterwards. We'll have to pay for all of this. And so the younger generation of Europeans may face a more constrained life than the ones that our generation have faced, where we've had nothing but the benefit of the European Union and the growth and prosperity associated with it. So I think these are just some of the consequences. And just to sum up, in lots of ways, I think that this war has shown that we have to think the unthinkable, because that's what we're confronted with now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Daly. I'll just ask a quick 1 minute follow-up based on your remarks. I mean, you basically are making the point that this has galvanized and stiffened. It has stiffened and galvanized the EU's resolve and purpose and commitment, and even leading to a kind of renewal. The one area that is an issue now is this the continuation of sanctions against Russian interests and individuals, and there's a kind of a brinkmanship taking place. On the one hand, you know, on the Russian side, they are suffering from sanctions, but also, you know, they may think that the Europeans also suffering from sanctions that they've been imposing as well. Do you think the sanctions will be sustained, and you know how the price will be very high moving forward? What do you think?
Well, I think firstly, our sanctions regime is designed as far as possible to target those responsible for the war on the Russian side, and also now on the Belarusian side. They're designed to increase the cost of all of this, the cost of waging war for Russia. Inevitably, this will cause disruption, and almost inevitably, there will be aspects of this which may also hit on our side as well because of the disruption. But we feel that the sanctions, in being deep and wide, these are crucial measures to try and stop this war and to encourage a complete pullback by Russia from this war. And whatever the cost of these sanctions, they're certainly a lot lower in cost terms to what might be the case if everything went even a lot worse.
Thank you, Ambassador Daly. We'll come back to you in the next round. Let me move to Ambassador Waldemar Dubniowski. Ambassador Dubniowski, You know, Thailand in the 1970s, 80s was called the frontline state. When we had the Khmer Rouge takeover and Phnom Penh, there were a lot of Cambodian refugees pouring into Thailand. And then when Vietnam invaded and occupied Cambodia for a decade from late 1978, we also had like hundreds of thousands in the millions of refugees coming across. So now, you know, I think Poland, I mean, not just a EU member, I mean, there are 27 EU members and 30 NATO members, and Poland is in both. And Poland is kind of in the front lines, a lot of the refugees coming in. And, you know, perhaps the Russian leadership, they may think that, of course, conducting this war, they must think that they can prevail, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. So from your perspective in Poland, what is happening? I mean, the refugees outflows, and then you know, the contingencies. What happens next, and how might this situation be ameliorated and return to some kind of a peace from your point of view?
Thank you very much. But first of all, of course, I would like to thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. It's always great pleasure visiting Chulalongkorn University. Great respect. Yeah. So definitely, it's only pity that it's such a.
And I'm sorry to not introduce you properly. Ambassador Dubinowski was formerly ambassador in Singapore. He has a very illustrious background in the private sector as well as government. I'll just note that he is a member of the Polish Olympic Committee, and also the chairman of the Polish Tennis Association, wide-ranging career. Sorry to interrupt you, Ambassador Dubinowski, please.
That's true. This such experience I also have as well. And as I mentioned, thanks really a lot. Always pleasure. This is definitely, in my opinion, very reputable and the best university in Thailand. So, dear professor, credit to you for organizing such interesting events. And I have to say that I couldn't agree more with our distinguished colleague, with Ambassador David. I can easily echo everything he just said. But having said that, I would like to add something also about the language and symbols. Because, of course, language and symbols matter. So, therefore, today, I brought with me David, if you can hold for a second. I believe that still my voice is loud enough. The Ukrainian flag as a symbol, just for all of us to, maybe I'll put it next to. So this is definitely the question, and this is still not all, because also for all of you, I have also the Ukrainian flag ribbon. So definitely something. Please help yourself. Mary as well. Yeah. Perfect. You're welcome. Later, you as well. Thank you very much. And because this is a symbol of solidarity with Ukraine, and for all of us to remember about our Ukrainian friends who are suffering, because they are definitely friends in need. So we have a saying in Poland that a friend in need is a friend indeed. So, and definitely it is really the case today, because they are suffering on a daily basis. So. Again, thank you very much for organizing this panel, because my personal impression is that the farther from Europe people are, the less informed they are, and the less chance they have to understand the real situation in Ukraine. So, in my opinion, outside of Europe, education's process about Putin's war, about even more than that, about Putin's Russia, is definitely needed. So, there's one exception, though, I would say America, because they immediately realized how dangerous the situation is and what potential consequences could be. So there's one of the reasons that why Secretary of State Blinken recently decided to visit many European countries, including Poland, of course. President Biden just recently conducted a phone conversation with our Polish President Duda, because the situation is really very serious. And Vice President Kamala Harris will soon going to visit Poland to show US support and NATO support for all our allies. But something important, since we are started with this European Union perspective, this is really something very important. I think that we have to realize as well that this truly important point that Ukrainians are Europeans. So in fact, Putin already invaded Europe, and not many people are very aware that there's already existing association agreement between European Union and Ukraine. Signed not yesterday, not 2 years ago, signed long time ago in 2014 and went into effect in 2017. So accession process of Ukraine to EU already started. And just last couple of weeks, 8 European Union presidents signed an open letter in supporting the process of Ukraine application to European Union. I have to sadly say that we are in Poland very well informed how the situation looks like in Ukraine. We don't need to watch media, we don't need to watch television, we simply observe what is happening on our borders. We are talking to all these Ukrainians, all these guys who fled Ukraine, and we know precisely how difficult and how challenging the situation in Ukraine currently is. But in this dark and very, very dark moment of history, there's maybe just a very tiny glimpse of hope from human perspective simply. Because in Poland, in my home country, there's 1,000, literally 1,000 of volunteers ready to help and already involved in this assistance process. They share their own flats, they share their own apartments, they share their own homes, they deliver the food, they collect the money, they are always ready to assist. So definitely, as Professor just mentioned, Poland is on the front line of this humanitarian aid. So we are the first one to meet with this humanitarian catastrophe. And I deliberately use this word humanitarian catastrophe because in my opinion, it's going to be, and it's already started, humanitarian disaster. Enormous number of refugees fleeing Ukraine every day. Around 100,000 daily. I repeat the number, 100,000 daily. So at the moment now, we have, only after 2 weeks of this invasion, we have already over 1,300,000 refugees in Poland. So it means that around 1,300,000 people have fled to Poland since Russia sent troops into Ukraine. And something which is even more frustrating, and this is sort of devastating news, that really reliable reports from British or American intelligence indicate that Russians often attack civilians and intentionally attack areas inhabited by civilians as well. So I have to say that even yesterday, it was, if my memory serves me well, it was the children's hospital which had been bombed by Russian missiles. So I have to admit that there's practically no word for it other than barbaric behavior. And this is the perspective. And of course, the legal aspect is very important because international law has been violated many times. And we are talking about breaking the principles of democracy, human rights, etc. There's no doubts about it. And as an international community, we can not agree to the violation of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. But the most important is, in my opinion, the human and humanitarian factor. Because people in Ukraine are really dying. This is the truth. So Ukrainians are fleeing the country, families are separated, civilians are trapped in the middle of hostilities, and humanitarian corridor is not being respected. and I don't even have to point it out who doesn't respect the humanitarian corridor, but this is definitely one side of this story. And of course, I have to underline, which recently became absolutely obvious, it's not the local issue, it's absolutely the global one. It's this is the war which soon or later affect also Asia, and as a consequence, Thailand as well. Actually, my personal impression is that Asia is being already affected, and in Thailand, we already see some of the consequences related to this Russian invasion. There is the number of tourists is decreasing, prices of fuel, food, etc. are rising. So this is just one of these very, so far, mild consequences. So definitely in our common interest is to do everything we can to make high pressure on Russia to end this war. So definitely. And something really important, because sometimes when there are discussion about this invasion, I am a bit surprised, because there is some sort of theoretical discussion about some sort of potential either conflict or whatever, and almost the symmetrical one. And in my opinion, we have to remember, there's no symmetry at all in this war. One country has been attacked, and another country is the aggressor. So I don't even need to ask you who is the aggressor. Everybody knows who is the aggressor, which country. So, therefore, today's solidarity with Ukraine, it's a duty, in my opinion, it's a duty of every decent human being. And as I mentioned already early, language is important. Also from this point of view, that there's a lot of propaganda and manipulation behind. And there's not a secret that Russia is a master of propaganda. So let me give you an example. If I break in your house, or maybe even better, if I break in British ambassador's residence, it's still a crime. And this is how we name it. And definitely, you never name it as a special civilian operation. It's simply break-in. So the same with Ukraine invasion. So this is not special military operation. It is purely military aggression. And this is absolutely the case. So we shouldn't be misled by the wording. So, and by the way, this information remains, and we know it in Poland very well, especially during this refugees crisis as well, but before, in our past, it was frequently used as one of the tools. So that this information remains one of the tools in Russia's arsenal, aimed not only at justifying the aggression against Ukraine, but also disturbing Western information space, hijacking our minds, sort of, and this is also quite dangerous as well. So the target of this information from the Russian point of view is not only Ukraine, and we have to remember, it's also the Western world and other countries as well. So, because they would like to attack to some extent our common values and principles. So maybe I stop here for a moment, and then we can follow.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Dubnyavsky. Just a quick follow-up based on what you've said, and we have taken all your points. Looking forward and looking out in the neighborhood, in Poland's neighborhood now, with the invasion, how might the region, Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, will it be reshaped? What's going to happen in the coming days? It's been 14 days of war, and it has not been a quick war. It might drag on, but there's a possibility that Russia might encroach further and eventually have some control over the territory of Ukraine. And how would this affect, your neighborhood from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania down to Poland, right down? What would be the reaction and response?
It's absolutely excellent question. Excellent question from our perspective, an excellent question what we are fighting for, to understand better what we are fighting for, and absolutely the question it can present you the real perspective of this Ukraine invasion. And actually, I should leave this question to our EU ambassador for a very simple reason. Just 3 days ago, European Union Vice President, so to some extent the boss of Ambassador Valdis Dombrovskis, clearly mentioned in his interview that next, after Ukraine, if Ukraine fails, will be a Baltic states and Poland. So precisely what he just said, if we do not support Ukraine, it is not going to stop in Ukraine. Clearly, Putin is now in some kind of aggressive war mood, and unfortunately, it is likely that this aggression will continue in other countries, he said. So, and definitely, this is also the way we see it in Poland. We have our experiences with Russia, or better to say with Soviet Union as well. So we know precisely that definitely just Ukraine is by far not enough from Mr. Putin's perspective. So definitely this is, I fully agree with Vice President Valdis Dombrovskis, Vice President of European Union. So definitely the next target, if somehow all of us, including European Union, including UK, including American, including including our Asian friend, if we not prevent this, if we not prevent Putin of taking over Ukraine, so definitely the next target will be Baltic states, Poland, and later on some other states as well.
Thank you, Ambassador Dubinowski. Let me move to the UK Ambassador, Ambassador Mark Gooding. Ambassador Gooding was educated at Oxford in modern languages. He speaks very, very good Thai and also excellent Mandarin, of course, completely fluent in French and German, and also Spanish. So he's multilingual. He's has been posted to Beijing. He has been ambassador, UK ambassador in Cambodia, and now he's here. Not so long ago, Ambassador Gooding, we had a lot of issues with the United Kingdom's exit from the European Union. It's been several years now, and it's final. So the EU now is not 28 but 27. But this war has kind of stirred up this mix, and it's kind of galvanized and I think provoked the European Union members to close ranks, to reunite, as we've heard from Ambassador Daly. But the UK and the United States also have had a big role here in this war, assisting Ukraine. The UK is a major NATO, long-standing NATO member. From your vantage point, this war, from the UK and maybe the US a little bit, do you think this will lead to the United States being more back into Europe and maybe leading to a tighter relationship between the UK-US, possibly? Because, in the last decade, the US has been all over the Pacific, Asia-Pacific, and now Indo-Pacific. And now there are questions about US orientation, geostrategic orientation. Will it still be Indo-Pacific? A lot of people, think tanks in the region, including us here in Thailand, wondering. So what's your vantage point looking out, US, UK, but UK, NATO, war, Russia's war in Ukraine?
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Dr. Titinan, and thank you for the invitation today. It's a delight to be here. And like my colleagues have said, our thoughts are with the people of Ukraine at the moment who are suffering so much devastation and harm. I will come to your question, Dr. Titinan, in a minute, but I would like to make 5 points in my remarks today. The first is to say very clearly that we see this as an assault on the international order that matters to all of us, including Thailand, including European countries, and every member state of the United Nations. President Putin has decided to invade a sovereign and free country. And this attack is completely unprovoked and completely unnecessary. And I'm very careful when I say it's a decision of President Putin here, and we do not have a fight with the Russian people, but the Russian government and President Putin have decided to do this. This is an egregious violation of international law and the UN Charter. The UN is an international body which is based upon sovereign member states. And so if you do not recognize that sovereignty, how does the UN function? So we must respect that, and it's absolutely crucial that the international community across the world stands up for sovereignty and territorial integrity at this moment in history. I think as well, the Russian government is breaching its own commitments from recent years, including the Budapest Memorandum, the Minsk Agreements. So there are real questions of confidence in the Russian government's word when it signs up to international commitments that I'll come to a little bit later. And from a UK perspective, this is a pattern of behaviour by the Russian government which I think falls outside what is acceptable internationally and international norms. So, for example, we had an attack in 2006 in the Ukraine using polonium, a highly radioactive material, on Alexander Litvinenko, which left traces of this material in public transport, in restaurants. It was a highly reckless attack which, of course, killed Alexander Litvinenko. We had nerve agent used against the Skripals in 2018. We've seen malign cyber attacks coming from Russia, as well as the international action that we've heard about previously in Georgia, previously in Ukraine. I would add Syria to the list as well, where we have here a government that is increasingly willing to go outside international norms of behaviour. And I think the brazen attack on a sovereign, free, independent state is a further example of this. And it means that the international community cannot allow this behaviour to go unchecked. My second point is that in the last 2 weeks we've seen an extraordinary degree of unity across the world, and I think this goes partly to answer your question, Dr. Titinan. We heard about unity within the EU earlier, but actually the unity goes a lot beyond this. And right now, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is actually in the US. I think we had the Polish Prime Minister and other Visegrad countries in the UK earlier this week. We had the Dutch Prime Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister. Many countries are working together to condemn the Russian attack and to force Russia to withdraw and de-escalate. And we've seen this in a variety of fora. The UN General Assembly vote last week had over 140 countries agreeing to deplore Russian action, to call on Russia to withdraw, and reasserting the UN's commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, which is a very important signal. In other UN fora, like the Human Rights Council, there's been an overwhelming agreement to launch an investigation. Over 30 countries have referred Russia to the ICC for an investigation into war crimes. The OSCE has launched an investigation, again with an overwhelming number of member states. And the Council of Europe has suspended Russia. So there is a degree of unity in response to this, which is very striking. And I think this answers your question in terms of future relationships. The UK is obviously not a member of the EU anymore, but these are fundamental principles that we all share that are being challenged, and we need to work together, and that is exactly what has been happening. My third point is to describe a little bit what the UK is doing in response, which is very closely coordinated with our partners. And we have an objective is clear, it's to make Russia de-escalate and withdraw. To do this, we are providing a lot of support for Ukraine, and that includes defensive military support. We've trained 22,000 soldiers and supplied anti-tank missiles. It includes economic support of over £100 million in aid, as well as hundreds of millions of pounds of humanitarian support as well. So that is a key part of this, helping Ukraine to defend itself and supporting the Ukraine economy. We're also working to isolate Russia internationally, which we're doing in the UN and the other organizations I've mentioned. So there will be a big political price and political pressure on Russia to withdraw. And we're also working hard on sanctions and other measures to ensure that Russia pays the maximum price for this. So to give you a few examples, over 3 million Russian companies are now unable to raise capital in the UK. We've sanctioned over 200 high-priority individuals, including President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov. We've cut off Russian banks who have assets of over £250 billion in the UK. We're going to phase out Russian oil imports by the end of this year. We've banned Russian aviation from the UK. The list goes on. And this is both an effort to maximize the price that Putin needs to pay for his efforts. It's aiming to reduce the ability of Russia to finance its war of choice. But also, I believe this sends a very strong signal to any other country around the world who's maybe planning in the future, now or later, to do something similar, that the cost of this type of action will carry a very heavy price. And that's why the international unity is so key. The other thing we're trying to do with our partners is, of course, to reinforce NATO with more deployments, particularly on the eastern flank, precisely to deter the action that my Polish colleagues has alluded to. My fourth point is that we need to be very aware of disinformation, again, as my Polish colleague has mentioned here. And this is, I think, a very prominent feature of the war that's going on at the moment, the degree to which the Russian government is putting out information that is false. And what does that mean for us? So, for example, for weeks and months before the attack 2 weeks ago, the Russian government was insisting at top leadership level that it was not going to invade Ukraine. And throughout this period, the UK and other governments were sharing intelligence saying the situation on the ground is such that it is very, very likely that Russia will invade. It's, what Russia is saying is completely the opposite is what's happening on the ground. So I think this draws into question whether Russia is sincere about taking forward a diplomatic track. Certainly before the invasion, it was clear that their actions were not consistent with their words. So I think we need to be very careful in terms of judging Russia by its actions, not just what it says. But I also think that we flagged up well before the 24th of February the likelihood that the Russian government would try to create a pretext for its attack on Ukraine, including potentially allegations of shelling of civilian areas, presenting its operation as a humanitarian operation. And of course, that is exactly what Russia did, completely baseless allegations about Ukraine shelling its own citizens, and really as a pretext for an attack. And I think my conclusion from this is both we need to question Russian sincerity on the diplomatic track while these actions are taking place, but also be very cautious about the information coming out. And even in the last 24 hours, we've seen allegations by Russia about biological and chemical weapons that the US has stringently denied. I worry that this may be simply trying to create another pretext or even a retrospective pretext for the actions it's already taken. And my fifth and final point is that I believe this campaign of disinformation also extends to Russian statements about NATO. NATO is not an expansionist organization. It's an organization of sovereign countries who decide with NATO members who joins. It is a defensive alliance. That is very clear. It makes decisions transparently. So allegations by Russia that Ukraine is somehow a military threat to Russia, or that NATO is, seeking to have some sort of military confrontation with Russia, I would say are completely false, and we must not be led astray by them. Equally, it's important that every sovereign country has the right to decide on its own defence arrangements, and that applies as much for Thailand as it does for the UK, as it does for Ukraine. So it's that sovereign country's decision. These decisions cannot be taken by a third country, and certainly can't be taken with threats of force, etc. So in conclusion, we believe that this matters to Thailand, it matters to the UK and all of our countries. We need to make a very robust response now to persuade Russia to de-escalate and withdraw, but also to send a strong signal for the future that this kind of action outside international law will not be tolerated by the international community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gooding. Just to inform you a little bit about the disinformation and information and verifiable and accurate information versus disinformation. So we have our audience members also include the international and Thai journalists. So they'll be reporting on this session. So it's important to hear what you think, all of you here. I also was thinking about the NATO. NATO, the old slogan of NATO. When I was studying back in the old days, long time ago, they thought that NATO was set up to keep the Americans in, the Germans down, and the Soviets out. Right? That was a slogan. And in a way, it's not just a rejuvenation of EU that we're seeing; it's also a rejuvenation of NATO. And just a little bit from your remarks on in the Thai context, would you believe it that, in Thailand, it's polarized like elsewhere, but the more conservative, the more supportive of Putin. the more progressive, the more supportive of Ukraine. This is the local application and implication of this war. And I'll just note also from your remarks that I've been kind of careful to say Russia, Russia, but in fact, from your remarks, very clear, this is Putin's war in Ukraine. And I think, to get right down to the truth, that's what it is. So I should start changing the name of Russia to Putin, interchangeable in a way, but maybe more potent. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you. I just now would like to introduce Ambassador Mary Thurston of New Zealand. She officially is the charge d'affaires, which means in our country, once you're ambassador for life. You're still ambassador, so I call you Ambassador Thurston. Ambassador Thurston is the head of the New Zealand Embassy for an interim period. She was educated like Ambassador Gooding at Oxford in English and modern languages, French in this case. She worked in the secondary education in the UK for some years before joining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Ambassador Thurston was New Zealand Ambassador High Commissioner to Poland, but accredited to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Georgia, and Ukraine. So she's here to tell us a little bit about her experience. Until recently, you were ambassador in Poland and looking after Ukraine within your portfolio. And more importantly, I thought, like Thailand, like a lot of countries, you mentioned the international order. The rules-based international order benefits everyone, but it benefits the small countries the most. So New Zealand is a small country, and it's far away from the war, but it is very active and vocal in voicing support for the rules-based international order, the UN Charter, international law, which has been blatantly violated. So from your point of view as a New Zealand representative, envoy, I mean, this is really undermining the rules-based world order, isn't it? And from your experience as ambassador accredited to Ukraine, any of this surprises you? And what might come next?
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, sawatika, greetings to you all. Thank you, Dr. Titinan, for the invitation to join this very esteemed panel today. I would, like other colleagues, first like to acknowledge the brave and steadfast people and government of Ukraine who are so valiantly defending themselves and in doing so defending all of us at the moment. You're right, I was New Zealand's ambassador to Ukraine for 4 years. I finished at the end of August last year. So just 6 months ago, I stood on the Maidan in Kiev, in Ukraine, as Ukraine celebrated 30 years of modern independence. There were big crowds, there was a parade, there was a fly-past, foreign dignitaries, all the usual things that you see at those kinds of celebrations. And there was a real sense of optimism for the future. You could feel it as you walked around the city in Kiev, and it was something that I perhaps wasn't familiar with from previous visits. But there was a definite something in the air, a real buzz, which was good to see. There was this sense of optimism for the future, even though they knew that future probably would continue to hold challenges. After all, there's been a war in Crimea and Donbass for the last 8 years. In fact, this week, I think it's 8 years exactly since the invasion of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. President Zelensky spoke, of course, as the president, and spoke of a young country with a 1,000-year history. He spoke of the Ukrainian people and their love of that country. And now, 6 months later, we can see how this love of country has translated into defiance, resistance, and above all, courage in the face of the Russian invasion and its ongoing consequences. But you've asked a key question, and I think also Ambassador Dubanyovsky alluded to it. What does this have to do with New Zealand? It's more than 17,000 kilometres between Wellington and Kiev. That's roughly halfway around the world. Why would 5 million Kiwis, of whom only about 1,300 have Ukrainian heritage, Why would we pay attention to what's unfolding in Ukraine at the moment? Well, I'd say three things really. The first is that it's in our natural character to care about these things. We have a sense of fairness and decency. We have a keenly developed sense of what might be right and wrong. And values inform our approach, and we aim to be consistent in those values. It's not the first time that we've taken positions, taken stands on issues which have impacted the whole world. And I think particularly back to the First and the Second World Wars, where thousands, tens of thousands of young New Zealanders went halfway around the world to defend the situation that was happening in Europe, and then ultimately in the Second War in the Pacific, and further north in the Pacific. And even back in that time, we welcomed a group of Polish refugees to New Zealand at the end of the war, Polish children who had nowhere else to go and needed a safe place to spend a few years. Nobody knew how long, but they were made welcome in New Zealand. That was New Zealand's first group of refugees, and they've been the foundation of the Polish community in New Zealand, and it's a story that's never been forgotten. Secondly, and I think this applies to all of us, there are economic consequences. Commodity prices, people have talked about food and fuel, the effect on global markets. All of these things have ripple effects, so we're not isolated from these kinds of situations. And finally, we're a small state, and as Professor Titinan has said, we're beneficiaries of a rules-based international orders, disproportionately perhaps, but that order creates space and opportunity for our voice and our views to be heard. We need the multilateral system to be functional and effective. We have a vested interest in its success, or we risk being silenced or strong-armed. And as Burhan Ghafoor, Singapore's United Nations permanent representative, put it last week in his country's statement to the United Nations General Assembly ahead of the vote, at which 141 countries expressed their concern at the aggression against Ukraine. This issue, what's happening now in Ukraine, is a matter of principle for all small states and a matter of fundamental importance for all members of the General Assembly. In other words, we're all in this together, whether we're big or small. If one's attacked, we're all threatened. So we need to stand up for the multilateral system, international law, the UN Charter, and when a P5 member violates the UN Charter and uses the privilege of the United Nations Security Council veto to avoid sanctions, we're obliged to do all we can to protest that. But you might ask, what can a country like New Zealand do? What could we do that would be meaningful? Well, I believe we can take a position, we can use our voice, and we can take actions which show solidarity based on values and consistency, all of which are features of the international rules-based order. And by ourselves, it might not mean much, but together we can amplify these key messages, add moral weight to collective efforts, and all of the things that my colleagues have referred to are the sorts of things that New Zealand is thinking about doing. But certainly we cannot do nothing. And what have we done? We've taken a position. Aotearoa New Zealand condemns unequivocally the unprovoked and unjustified attack by Russia on Ukraine. We've used our voice. We've spoken out in the United Nations General Assembly, at the Human Rights Council, in multiple statements, in our parliament, with international partners. We've talked to people wherever we can get an audience that will hear us. And we've taken action. Humanitarian support, an initial contribution of funds to support people in Ukraine, and considering further support. We've changed our immigration settings, which, if you've paid any attention to those in the last 2 years, you will know have been some of the tightest in the world. It's been very difficult for people to come across New Zealand's borders during the pandemic. So we have expedited visas and entry arrangements for people, Ukrainians who already have connections in New Zealand, and I think we're looking to see what else might be able to be done in that area. And for New Zealand, which doesn't have autonomous sanctions legislation, so we're not able to do anything sanctions-wise outside there being a UNSC resolution, just yesterday we've passed a specialised piece of legislation to allow sanctions against Russia. This legislation had all party support, so that sense of unity has gone right across the New Zealand political scene, and all of the parties have come in behind this legislation, which will freeze assets, prevent the relocation of money and assets to New Zealand that might happen if people are trying to avoid sanctions elsewhere. And we're stopping super yachts, aircraft and ships from entering New Zealand. New Zealand's a popular destination for some of the people that are targeted. We've already put in place travel bans, including against some Belarusians who've been complicit in what's been happening in Ukraine. We've put export controls on Russian military and security forces so that they cannot use anything that comes from New Zealand in the actions that they are taking. And we've stopped foreign ministry consultations between our two ministries. We've joined united and coordinated measures against Russia in solidarity with Ukraine and the international community, including an international fora. And something else that New Zealand's done, and we did it in fact when the invasion and the annexation of Crimea took place, we've appealed to our country, to our economic entities, to companies in New Zealand, absent sanctions of another sort, to desist from backfilling gaps that might arise in selling products to Russia because others have to get out because of sanctions. So to their credit, New Zealand companies have appreciated the moral situation and have avoided profiting from the situation by backfilling where other countries have had to withdraw from the Russian market in terms of goods and services. So put simply, we stand with Ukraine. It's the right thing to do. Slava Ukraini, no rera tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, kopunka.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Thurston. You mentioned the UN. I just mentioned that the recent vote, the resolution on aggression against Ukraine. The vote was 141 for, 35 abstentions, and only 5 against. And now I want to come. Thank you very much. And we're going to come to Dr. Kandati Supamongkon. It's really a pleasure, and thank you for your patience waiting for your turn. It's really a pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Kandati again after some time when he was last here on stage with us. I've known him for the past 3 decades, and back then he was a diplomat for 10 years at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand, and he rose up to be the director of policy and planning. And then he left for a political career. Of course, he eventually became, after elections and so on, became Thailand's last foreign minister before the first of the 2 coups in the 21st century. So that was 2005, 2006. Since then, Dr. Kandati has been the visiting professor at UCLA, where he received his undergraduate education. He received his MA at the American University and PhD at the University of Southern California, USC. He has taught international law, international humanitarian law, and his very long, illustrious background. But I'll just say this. If you ever go to Sukhumvit 26 in that area, that's his family enterprise business. He's also the head of the Ganta Enterprise International that develops property in that whole area. Dr. Kandati, we heard about New Zealand being a small country that can punch above the weight by standing up for the international system, the rules-based international system, which is kind of an international public good because it benefits everyone, right? I'm going to come to you for Thailand's positions, but on top of it, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, Dr. Kandati actually has met President Putin back in his time as foreign minister, and also Foreign Minister Lavrov. So maybe a little bit about, we had this discussion a little bit earlier, and you made this point, I think, has Putin gone too far here? I mean, he could have maybe already got away with Crimea, maybe Donbass, but then invasion of Ukraine. This is a whole full-scale war, and it stirs up the whole world, And then your personal experience, perhaps, what do you make of these leaders in your time? Your personal encounter, and then finally, if you can just touch on the Thai. Our leader said we're going to be neutral, which reminds me, by the way, back in the Iraq War, the initial impulse of the then Prime Minister Thaksin was that we're going to be neutral. But then, of course, he was reminded we're a U.S. treaty ally, and then Thailand quickly joined the war effort. So our leaders now say neutral, but then we voted in the UN for the resolution aggression against Ukraine. Dr. Kanati.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Thitinan. It has indeed been a long time since we started working together in different areas, and we became close friends throughout these years. And I'm so pleased that I came back. I actually am now based in Los Angeles, and I came back just a few days ago, did my one-night quarantine, and was invited to come here. And I appreciate the invitation. And I would like to share with you, of course, some of my personal perspective, as well as the broader picture of the situation. So you mentioned that I have met with President Putin. I have met him on 2 occasions. We had an official visit to Russia, and we were invited to have dinner with him at the official residence way outside of Moscow. I looked into his eyes, and I wasn't sure if I saw his soul or not. But what I got back from these different meetings was that, first, he was a calculating man. And the second one was, of course, the word that came to mind. He had the potential to be ruthless. He had a strange, kind of a different sense of humor. We talk about British sense of humor, but I recall that our Prime Minister was surprised when Putin said at the end of the dinner that he would personally take us back to the airport, which was quite a long way away from his residence. And the Thai Prime Minister was then invited to the car. And we diplomats know the fact that in our protocol, different seats in the car had different ranks. So, and my Prime Minister was educated of that, was given that information. And but to his surprise, the assistant took him straight to the car and pointed towards the front seat next to the driver. And my Prime Minister then said, well, I thought it was a mistake. Is this, and then he asked the assistant again, are you sure front seat? And the assistant says, yes, this is your seat, Prime Minister. And he said, well, he was boiling inside. My Prime Minister then had some emotions, but he thought he was in Russia. He was with Putin, and he had to behave. So he didn't want to show his temper inside. And so he grudgingly sat sat on that seat. And then he thought, well, look, I might as well be polite to the driver, since I'm going to be sitting with him for a while. So he turned to the driver, and it was Putin. And so he was relieved, because at least that was not an insult. And Putin turned to him and said, well, if you trust me, don't wear your seatbelt. That was his sense of humor, I believe. The other one that was quite interesting was when we met him again in Malaysia. There was an ASEAN meeting with Russia involved, and we all had to get dressed in the local attires. And we were actually scheduled, I was scheduled to sign a treaty between Thailand and Russia with Lavrov. And Putin and our Prime Minister were actually going to witness that. Well, it was scheduled for 10:30 at night, which was late, but nevertheless, the dinner went quite long. The dinner went until 11. This was the ASEAN dinner. And so we said to the Russians, let's rush to the to sign the treaty, and then let's go to bed. And Putin sent us a message saying that he would not be seen signing or witnessing the signing without a suit on. So he insisted on going back to his room, different hotel, and we signed the treaty at 1:30 in the morning. Just because of that, he said, Russian television would not look kindly at him if he had a Malaysian shirt on. We did ask him to support our candidate for the UN Secretary General, and his answer was quite interesting. He said something which made our candidate quite happy. But I listened to what he said, and there was no content, there was no commitment, but it was a feel-good answer. So what he did was he looked at our candidate in the eye for a minute, and then he said, you already look like a UN Secretary General. That's all he said. Very, very happy for the candidate, but Russia did not support Thailand, and I knew that there was lack of content. So I agree with all our previous speakers that the violation of the territory of Ukraine, the use of force against another country is a serious violation of international law. However, I think there is another aspect of that violation which was even worse for me, and that was the targeting and the killing of innocent people, civilians, kids, the hospital just less than 24 hours ago. I did not expect that. It's a war crime for sure, but it's multiple actions which all were eligible for war crime trials. However, the problem with the present international system is that we do have the International Criminal Court, but the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court is still a problem because, first of all, the court would have jurisdiction if the country involved was part of the Rome Statute. And the Ukraine, as well as Russia, are not. So there's no basis for the jurisdiction of the ICC. But in addition to that, the court does provide the possibility that jurisdiction could be obtained if the United Nations Security Council recommends. And we know that the United Nations Security Council will definitely not recommend because of the veto ability of a permanent member of the Security Council. So that's a big question mark. Crimes for sure, serious war crimes. But how are we going to bring a sitting president of a permanent member of the Security Council to court? That seems an impossible task at this time. Of course, maybe some other courts can be created with different jurisdictions. The vote in the UN, I remembered very well the Uniting for Peace resolutions back in the 50s allowed for the first time when, well, that was actually a situation with regarding Korea. So the Soviet Union then was ready to block the formation of UN forces in Korea, but what happened then was suddenly the Soviet delegation decided to boycott the Security Council, and the boycott was because they were protesting against the inability of Beijing to become a member. Taipei was a member then. And so they missed the vote a couple of times. And because they missed the votes in the Security Council, the Security Council was able to create the UN forces in Korea when they realized that they never miss another meeting of the Security Council. And then they started to veto subsequent draft resolutions, which led to the Uniting for Peace resolution, allowing the General Assembly to take action instead, but not binding, but at least it reflects the will of the international community. And I was pleased that Thailand was able to give the yes vote. And there's no other choice. We have the violation of international law as well as criminal war crimes being committed at this point. Now, I was in the US when things started to develop. And I was a bit puzzled by one thing. I agreed with what President Biden had done. I agreed with what the EU had done. But one thing puzzled me, and that was, even though we all know that Ukraine is not part of NATO, and therefore Article 5 could not be triggered. However, the use of force, of course, in general terms, can still take place for other reasons than Article 5. But I agree with the fact that Article 5 would not be triggered, of course, and also agreed that the use of force against Russia would be devastating. But what confused me was, why did President Biden open that card prematurely at the offset to say to the world and to Russia that we will not use force against Russia. We will use only economic sanctions. I thought to myself, why open this card? Because obviously he had to do the risk calculation. And the message there was that, okay, the biggest risk of the US and NATO using force against his aggression is gone. And it's gone until Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, which then gives, it seems, an incentive psychologically to say, oh, well, let's do it now. Because if we wait and suddenly Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, then it would trigger that. So it seems like it's sending an unintended message to say that we will definitely not use force. Now, even though we're not going to use force against, NATO and the US would not use force against Russia for Ukraine, but why reveal that? Why not make it something that he had to put into his calculation? That was the question that I had in my mind, and I could not really resolve that because I thought, I still think that if that was not clearly stated, maybe he would come to a different conclusion. It's similar to the Chinese situation here. Taiwan is definitely not a treaty ally of the US, but the Chinese, I'm sure, feel that if a Chinese invasion of Taiwan takes place, the US may respond with a military action, and that is a big deterrent. So that was a bit of a question mark. The miscalculation that I saw, beyond that was the fact that the military buildup seemed to have been quite successful. It was scary. U.S. intelligence and British intelligence were saying that they would be ready to invade if they wished. It was at that point. It reminded me of 2003 when the U.S. built up sufficient forces against Iraq. And I thought that was a success because Saddam Hussein was ready to open up his country for inspection at the height of the buildup. And then this decision to invade happened, and then the picture became very different. And it was not a victory that the U.S. had wanted. And this was something that was in a way similar. The French president went and sat across Putin long table and came back to say that, let's implement the Minsk agreement, the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accord would have enabled the two, more or less, separatist Donbass states to be to have some autonomy. But in addition to that, to have possibly a veto power against the Ukraine joining NATO. And it was not likely that Ukraine would be accepted into NATO anyway in the foreseeable future. So the build-up, more or less, the Russian build-up, more or less ensured that Ukraine would not be part of NATO. He had a lot of bargaining power then, I thought. President Biden, Macron, they were ready to go and meet him, even virtually, at his call. Everyone was acknowledging the importance of Russia, and that was what he was trying to rebuild, because he felt that Russia was placed on the sideline, and he wanted Russia to go back to be respected again, So it was all there. So I thought to myself, don't invade. You have already won. And then he decided to do that. And I thought that was a major miscalculation. And it seems to me that he thought that Ukrainians would not put up a big fight, similar to how former President Bush thought that Iraq would not put up a big fight. Invasion would have been over. the so-called quote-unquote, with all due respect, President Zelensky, from the eyes of Putin, was a comedian, a young comedian. He would probably run away, probably. I remember Zelensky giving an interview just before the attack, saying that I've been trying to call Putin, but the phone would not be picked up, you know. Yeah, that was a very bad sign. So he thought it would have been very easy to move in. Maybe 1 day or 2 days, the military would have had a coup, maybe. And he encouraged the coup against Zelensky, and then a different president who would serve Russia would come in, right? Well, that didn't happen. And the other miscalculation is the fact that the Ukrainians were able to fight back in such a powerful way. And then another miscalculation was that the Russians were not able to fight as well as many people, including probably President Putin, expected. So those were the miscalculations and the biting and the powerful aspects of the sanctions have been very successful. Maybe I should leave it here, and then we can continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kanati. Very rich, and it's great. You know, these days we record our events, and this one we will really record it because the comments and remarks here will be not only quoted and used in the local and international media, but also we'll use this for class material across the different classes and what you have done. And I am a little bit envious, I have to say. You know, he began as a diplomat and then became elected politician, then became foreign minister, and now professor. So, you know, I'm just a run-of-the-mill professor. He really knows the stuff from the ground and from experience. So the insights you shared, I mean, these are just anecdotes, but they're very insightful about Mr. Putin. And I'll just say, you used the word ruthless, calculating, but you know, the seatbelt anecdote suggests that there's a little bit of a recklessness in there. In addition to, seems like a man of the unexpected actions, right? You know.
Yes, and I think the man that I saw then is a different man now, because one thing, isolation for 2 years, being so scared of COVID, and surrounding himself with people who probably would just say yes, sir, to whatever he thinks. But one aspect of that is the fact that I think that he is ruthless, he's willing to kill others, but he's not suicidal. And you can see that clearly. He's afraid of COVID. He's not suicidal. But he did mention a nuclear alert, which is quite interesting, because the nuclear alert in Russia has 4 levels. So what he did was he raised it from just the normal maintenance of nuclear weapons to an elevated alert, which actually meant making sure that the communication line is working, making sure that hardwares are in good place, all ready. But there are 2 more steps to that, and the third one is known as a danger level, and then the 4th one is full alert. So we're at the 2nd level, but I think that it's a bluff more, because he's not suicidal. But the same would probably not apply to chemical weapons and biological weapons. That's a different equation. And although he's not suicidal, there is a fear, though, that if he feels that he is being boxed in and he would die anyway, then I think we're in great danger. So that's a delicate balance that we have to make sure that we don't get to that place. Because he, in international relations, we always look at, when we analyze and we think, well, COVID, 2 years isolation, maybe he's a bit mad. It could be true that he's a bit mad, but on the other hand, by appearing mad, he makes his threat more credible. So a madman would be able to use nuclear weapons more. So in that sense, appearing to be mad could increase his bargaining power. So I'm not sure, it's a mixture. That's for all the analysts to figure it out. But two sides to everything.
Yeah, thank you very much.
If I may just briefly jump in, because what Minister just said about all these nuclear threats, I think indeed there are some other steps to call, but I tend to disagree that we will be in danger. In my opinion, we are already in danger with regard to all this nuclear threat. Maybe because I'm not sure whether you observe carefully the situation in Ukraine, but in my opinion, nuclear threat is very serious as never before. It's as serious as never before, either intentionally or by chance, just by chance, by playing with all this nuclear power plant. Just yesterday, we've been informed that there is a lot of technical issue with Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Couple of days ago, it was another question, another problem with one of the largest nuclear power plant in Zaporozhye. So even without pushing this nuclear button, simply by chance, by being irresponsible, you can cause this nuclear threat by far. So, and I agree with you that maybe he's not suicidal, but definitely he's not a Superman. So definitely he is not this type of guy who can assure, okay, I have everything under control. Definitely it's not the case. And there's also some sort of interesting observation. If you look at the way he communicates with his own staff, with his generals, with his ministers, so you have long table, 10, 12 meters long. Putin is on one side, and all these very respectful and high-rank officials are on the other end, 12, 10, 15 meters apart. Honestly, I never, ever seen such a way of communication, which means that probably there's also some sort of internal problems, internal issues, internal disbelief. So this is something completely unexplainable. This is the only way we can say. And by the way, talking about all this anecdotal issues, so we in Poland, and coming back to the point we both raised earlier with the disinformation. So generally, we used to say in Poland that we can only believe information that has already been denied by Kremlin. So all the other information absolutely are not important.
Thank you very much. Well, we're just coming to the last round here. So for a couple of minutes each, I would like to do this. First, I want to go back to Dr. Ganati for, now with the ASEAN summits, ASEAN-related summits coming up this year, we already had problems with Myanmar. Who represents Myanmar, whether Myanmar will be included, the ASEAN summit, and then, later on in October, November, from APEC to the East Asia summit. Now we also have the addition of Russia. If Russia comes, who else will come or not come? So for ASEAN, this is far-reaching. Already a problem with Myanmar, but now also Russia. So I'm just going to ask you a little bit about that, Dr. Ganati, and also what should Thailand's position be? Moving forward, I mean, if you foreign minister advising the foreign ministry, Thailand position, and just to allude to your point about the Biden, and I agree about the Putin miscalculation, but the Biden giving away that card by suggesting at the outset, no boots on the ground, no commitment of forces. But would this reinforce Putin's view? I mean, is he thinking that the West is weak, right? They can assist all they want, but they will not commit troops. So a couple of
Yes.
minutes.
Well, let's see. Well, first of all, the point made regarding the present danger of nuclear accidents, more or less, it's there. It's definitely there. The reckless bombing of the nuclear facilities. So we are in a situation in which mistakes can lead to catastrophe. And escalation can be unintentional, but can be also devastating, any escalation. So that's something that we have to be very careful about. Now, the message regarding whether there's a weakness or not, you will recall that, I think, the Russians really, especially Putin, wants NATO to be weakened, because NATO, of course, in his mind had expanded from 15 members at the end of the Cold War to 30, and on his border. In fact, right next, Kaliningrad is surrounded by 2 NATO countries. And he didn't react then, which was a surprise, because that's right next door, and he has that small enclave outside of the mainland Russia, being surrounded by NATO. But anyway, the fact that he miscalculated then, and at this point, I think it's important for ASEAN to send that same message that the international community has been sending, and that is the use of force, war, initiated the way it has been, is unacceptable. That has to be there. Whether or not Russia gets invited to future meetings, I think that remains to be evaluated. Myanmar is a different situation in which the persons in charge now came as a consequence of a unconstitutional takeover, more or less, a coup. This has been a legitimate government, but is now behaving in such a way that it should be isolated and punished. So that's a different kind of decision to be made.
Thank you. So foreign invasion in Russia, Ukraine, as opposed to domestic seizure of power by the military in Myanmar. Dr. Ganati, just a quick one on Thailand, just 1 minute. So far, how would you assess the Thai response to this war, and what would you recommend moving forward?
I was very pleased to see that Thailand voted in favor of the UN General Assembly resolution, one of the 141. Of course, if we hadn't done that, we would have joined the group of 2 ASEAN members now, Vietnam and Laos, that abstain. I think it's important to keep in mind that each country will have to weigh different options based on their perception of national interest. And so it's not a surprise to me that this kind of debate would be going on. Should we really be neutral, or should we not be? And it's to me, it could be a healthy debate, because it's a debate, and then the conclusion, though, the conclusion was the vote in favor, and that was the one that counts. Now, however, you would probably remember that not long ago, just a couple of weeks, ASEAN came out with a statement, just just after the invasion, and that was very, very neutral. I was disappointed myself to see that because I expected ASEAN to have been a bit more firm on the stand against aggression, you know. So, but then now Thailand will have to proceed in this right direction. I think international law, law-based community must be preserved.
Thank you very much. I'll just note that Putin's invasion has become the latest divisive issue for ASEAN. You mentioned a group of 2, Laos, Vietnam abstained. The other 8 voted for the resolution. And on Thailand, it would not be surprising Thailand, just to remind all of us. I mean, traditionally we have the Yep Rua Song Kam, which means Thailand's always have the feet on different boats and to both sides historically. But this time is driven not by survival, like World War II in the past with the colonial imperialism, but this time it's the domestic politics that drives it. I'll just come for 1 minute each. I know that UK Ambassador Gooding has to go on time. What could lead to an end game? I'll just take one question from our audience member about the Ukraine status. And I'll go this way, just Ambassador Thurston first for New Zealand. How would you like to see this? I mean, international system to be maintained, of course. What would be the kind of end result that New Zealand would like to see out of this present situation? And for our UK, Polish, and EU ambassadors, would neutrality status for Ukraine, and that's a question from our audience member, by the way, be a way out of this war? So, Ambassador Thurston, New Zealand, small country, far away, but big stakes in the international system. Well, how would you like to see this kind of come to an end?
Thanks for the question. I mean, I think first and foremost, we'd like to see Russia withdraw and for this to stop the devastation to the people, stop the devastation to the countryside, to the infrastructure, everything that's going on as a consequence of this invasion. So first and foremost, we'd like Russia to stop what it's doing, withdraw and retreat. Overall, we want to see the international rules-based order prevail. We want to see it come out of this strengthened. As we've discussed, as a small state, we rely on that international rules-based order as a way to go about our business and to interact with others. So it's just fundamental to us. And that's what we'd like to see. And just one other thing I'd like to add is that I personally am not remotely surprised at the way that Ukrainians are standing up for themselves in this situation. When people say that they are surprised, that they didn't expect it, I wonder how many Ukrainians they've ever met. They are very, very proud, determined, resilient, stubborn people who will do everything possible to defend themselves and to defend their homeland.
Thank you very much. So this is a time even more pressing, to even more imperative to maintain the rules-based international order. Ambassador Gooding, would neutrality status for Ukraine be a way out of this? Would the war stop or not?
Well, our starting point is that Ukraine is a sovereign country. The United Nations has recognized this in admitting Ukraine as a sovereign member. The Russians have recognized this in their international commitments in the past, as have we all. And therefore, it is entirely up to Ukraine to determine its political posture, its defense posture. No other country can say you must do this or you must do that. In terms of endgames I'm seeing, obviously I don't know yet. I think the themes I would highlight are, number one, the resistance, the amazing resistance that the Ukrainian people and army have shown, and I would expect that resistance to continue. Number two is the international unity condemning Russian action, including the sanctions I've mentioned. I think they're tough. I think there's a huge amount of political support behind them. It's not just governments. The British people have donated over £100 million in assistance to Ukraine already in the last 2 weeks. British business is acting. So this is a very, international sports bodies are reacting. This is a very wide consensus, and I think that unity will continue. So the outcome I expect is for Ukraine to be a sovereign country.
Thank you. Ambassador Dubnyavsky, the table, the meeting over the long table at a distance, is a very telling image. So
Definitely it is.
Is it possible that the table could be turned, meaning that if this continues, the war is not concluded quickly for Putin, he will be the one under more pressure? Would that be the case?
Let's hope. Let's hope, because generally I believe, and all of us believe, that ordinary Russian people, they are decent people, they are decent men. So, but unfortunately, they have a bad luck that they are being ruled by unpredictable aggressors at that point. So, hopefully, at one point, the table could have been changed. But, and something else, because I'm not sure whether a lot of people realize that so far, Putin has failed in the international arena. He has united practically the entire Western world against him. He discredited Russia's image totally, without any questions. He initiated the collapse of the Russian economy, and he caused also sanctions to be imposed on Russia. So, and something else, something very personal. His personal image as a tough man has been absolutely broken, absolutely destroyed. If today you would like to ask in any country audience, who among those two guys, President Zelensky or Putin, is the statesman, the response and the answer was probably 99, even if not in 100%, sure that President Zelensky is the truly and real statesman. So from the Putin perspective, from the Russia perspective, I think the war so far has been already not successful at all. Let's put it mildly, not to mention that almost lost in terms of this image and all the other and relation with some other guys. And so far, what we have to do, we have still stick to the sanction, because the sanction is the only and the best instrument which we have to our disposal so far, of course. And naturally, no one will expect that that sanction will stop Putin immediately, but definitely it hurts Russian economy, definitely it hurts Russian oligarchs, definitely it hurts Russian generals, definitely it hurts the family of Russian politicians, the family of Russian generals, the family of Russian oligarchs. So at the end of the day, they will have to make a choice. Either still stand by Putin or to try and find out any other solution. So this is what I believe in.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Daly, last word from you. The one unintended consequence from Mr. Putin's side must be that this war has galvanized and motivated the European Union purpose and resolve. So you see this as a net, coming out of this in the coming days and weeks, eventually, this will actually be a net gain for the EU, perhaps, even tighter integration, ever closer, and if so, in what way? Any last word from you?
Okay, thank you very much. We could do an entire seminar on what I'm going to say next, which is that the story of the European Union, the evolution of the European Union, is a story of European countries agreeing to do more and more things together in the face of overwhelming crises. And this chapter will also show a greater degree of unity in a number of areas. I've already mentioned them. In relation to your question about the endgame, I fully agree with Ambassador Gooding. Ukraine is a sovereign country and so on. It is for them. That is what we believe in. That is what we must protect in terms of the international community, the right of sovereign states, and to reject the idea which is trying to be foisted upon us, to reject the idea of spheres of influence, a concept which is more to the 19th or even 20th century than the 21st century. I want to come back to two other points. One is on refugees. I mean, refugees are pouring over the borders of EU member states. And of course, there will have to be a burden sharing of coping with refugees. It is not for Poland alone. It is not for Hungary alone, not for Slovakia, Romania alone. It's for the European Union and for the wider international community together. There, a footnote. This problem has a long origin, and I would identify also the weaponizing of migrants by Belarus a number of years ago as a foretaste of this, as an attempt to see how weak or otherwise might Poland and the European Union be. So I've just identified that as another element in this story. Finally, you put the question earlier about the Baltics. I mean, certainly there is genuine fear amongst the Baltic countries. There are debates about neutrality and how to position oneself in other countries of Europe in that region that today are neutral. But this falls into, to my mind, this falls into the category where we have to be careful. We have to think the unthinkable. So these fears in Baltic countries, which are genuine, have to be fully factored in, because the unthinkable is happening today in the tragedy of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Thank you very much. I want to thank our audience members here in this room and also online for joining us. And please join me in thanking the speakers here, Ambassador David Daly, Ambassador Waldemar Dubiniowski, Ambassador Mark Gooding, Ambassador Mary Thurston, and Dr. Kanati, Professor Kanati Supamongkon. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.